Unless it's pouring down rain, I love hiking. And one of the pleasures of hiking is packing my backpack. It's so much fun because I like to imagine I'll pack for any given need that may arise on my adventure. As a kid, that always meant packing a bright red Swiss Army knife. Most people had one growing up. The red color and the white cross on the knife always reminded me of a first aid kit, so I felt safe having the knife, even though I cut myself probably way more times with it than any other knife. That one tool probably saved my life more than I can count, in my young imagination anyway. That knife could solve any problem a young person might encounter in the woods. There's even a corkscrew. For a 10-year-old who needs a nice cold Chablis after a long day's trek, that knife had me covered. I'm still that way, trying to always be prepared. For example, after hearing about the possible earthquake that could hit Portland a few years ago, I created a survival kit for each of my kids, my wife, and myself, and I put all the supplies in a backpack. And then I put each backpack in their car because I didn't want them to be in their closet, which I figured that's where they would end up. I take a similar approach to dealing with world events, wildfires, crazy politicians, and war. I use the Swiss Army knife of psychological metaphor for dealing with life. One tool I use in my Swiss Army knife is research. When I hear about gun violence, I research immediately about what the likelihood is per school, per child. Then I research what my children's schools are doing to keep my children safe. Other tools include talking with my kids, voting for politicians and supporting causes to reduce the threat of violence. I do the same thing with climate change and several other issues. I also reframe and challenge my way of thinking if I get too pessimistic. I also challenge my biases that lead me to be too pessimistic, as I said, because if I become too pessimistic, I become fatalistic, and that leads to inertia. And then I can't make any difference, even a tiny one in the world. If I stay mostly positive most of the time, I stay engaged, I feel I can contribute in some small way, and being a part of the UU congregation has shown me that it takes a lot of people doing what they can do to make something happen. I'm only a small part of that, but I am a part of it. And I'm sure you've heard about reframing, positive affirmations, challenging your biases. I use those tools in my Swiss Army knife of mental health. But I would like to share with you one tool I bet you've never heard of, probably not, and one that I use actually from time to time. It's called holding the tension of the opposites. It's a term coined by Carl Jung and written about by psychologist, author, poet Marion Woodman. And regarding the tension of opposites, she writes, life's great challenge is in developing an integration between the spirit and the body. From this integration, there arises what she calls a divine tension, allowing for a new consciousness to unfold. So let me explain how it works. On the one hand, you have, let's say, despair of the world. On the other hand, you have, let's say, joy of life. Despair, joy. As you hold these two opposite ideas, don't allow yourself to be pulled one way or the other. Your job is to feel the tension of those opposites, to live in the discomfort of that place, which seems beyond reconciliation. From mindfully holding the tension, a middle way emerges. A growth in your thinking that was not there previously will appear, because it's out of this insoluble dilemma that something new is born. It may seem impossible. That's the point. Because on one level, that's what life is. It's where we live. It's the world we inhabit. It's all the opposites, all the time, existing together on this big blue planet where we live.
Our reading today is called Presence, and it's by David Outen. And he writes, people's lives take them to strange places. Alan Moore observed. They do strange things, and sometimes they can't talk about them. During these times, welcoming silence rather than speech, presence, and the absence of words or advice may be more therapeutic than anything else, allowing the mind and the heart space for roaming, freedom to both think and feel as one needs to, in the moment, and without any judgments or preconceived notions about how best to cope with the strain of life. The strange simultaneousness of life's happenings can be disorienting. A Toyota commercial runs across a television screen with shiny vehicles and smiling faces, while millions of miles away in the very same moment, a 10-year-old boy dies in the Ukraine, and the world moves on. Presence pools wherever you are, gathering where it will, haunting the hills of the desert, glowing amidst daylight, dancing across the dawn, hovering over the face of the oceans, or gently across a bed of pine needles lining the shadowed floors of the forest. It only takes a moment to notice the ways place calls to you and has a way of getting into you, its presence gradually stilling the noise and commotion within, or how being in the presence of another who cares without any discourse at all can bring you a sense of peace. Usually you notice the presence of a person or place where there is absence, the absence of words, a lack of activity, some sudden deficit in the plans for the day. When you are graced by the presence of a friend, there can be healing, an invitation to rest, permission to simply be. Once touched by the presence of another in love, friendship, or through shared suffering, you are never the same. You are left with an invisible and unerasable mark, a type of totem, imperceptible to the eyes. Our second reading this morning is, of course, The Peace of Wild Things by Wendell Berry. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. About a month ago, I did a question box service. For those who weren't here, a question box service is where we hand out index cards when folks arrive for the service, and I invite them to write down a question, which I will then endeavor to answer. And every year when I do these, I always get several questions on some particular topic, and it lets me know that I need to preach a whole sermon on something. Some years ago, it was Trump. How do we cope with relatives who love him? How do we affect the way the country is turning? What happened to civility? Last month, there were a couple of questions that had several people's attention. One was about the congregation and social justice. We will be paying more collective action to that next year, and it was good to hear those questions. But the common topic The other common topic were what I'm calling questions of despair. How do we cope with climate change and the fact that our world may not be safe for our children and grandchildren? How do we watch the news and not be completely overwhelmed? The war in Ukraine, racism, so much horrific stuff just feels like it keeps happening. And then 2.5 weeks ago, an 18-year-old walked into an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas, and killed 19 children and 2 adults. We don't know his motivation. And this happened mere days after another young man, motivated by racism this time, killed 10 people shopping at a grocery store in a black neighborhood in Buffalo. And the shootings haven't stopped since then. No one claims that they want children or shoppers or worshipers to be killed. But it is both astounding and horrific to me that a certain political party is pushing laws that will deny women the right to make their own medical choices, that they will deny transgender people and parents of trans kids the rights to make their own medical decisions, but that even basic common sense control of guns is off the table. There are fewer restrictions on assault rifles than there are on operating a car legally. If you allow 18-year-olds to buy assault rifles and allow nearly anyone to buy semi-automatic weapons and enough ammunition to kill numerous people, especially after Sandy Hook, you sure as hell don't get to call yourself pro-life. You just don't. So yes, I understand the question, what do we do about despair? I feel this question deep in my relational heart. How do we cope with all of this despair? How do we cope with compassion fatigue? How do we take care of ourselves and our children when the world is so brutal, to use a word of Glennon Doyle's? How do we avoid the completely understandable desire to simply bury our head in the sand? And yet, how do we take care of ourselves so we can continue and not just give up? I can't even tell you how much I wish I had the one single answer that would work for everyone. Although I take some comfort in the fact that if I did, I probably wouldn't be your minister. I'd probably be Oprah Winfrey or Glennon Doyle or maybe the president. But I'm just me, and I'm who you've got, and so I will try. The caveat is there is no one answer that will work for everyone. And so I'm going to give you a few options. My first answer, and one of the ones that I gave during the question box service, is to stop watching too much news. Now, I read news, I read quite a lot of news. My children call it my bummer phone because I'll be reading my phone and I'll say, oh God, I can't believe that happened. And my kids say, Mom, stop with the bummer phone. Read news from a variety of trustworthy sources. I read my stuff online. I like the New York Times, I like the Guardian and the Washington Post and the Atlantic and the New Yorker magazines and CNN's 5 Things Daily. You find what works for you. I will tell you that stories shared by your friends on Facebook don't have a high rate of trustworthiness, because they're designed to make you click and share, and it is stories that back up your own beliefs, often in sensational ways, liberal or conservative, that make folks click and share, and that is how they earn money, and that is not a good way to get your news. Use social media wisely. It will do you better if you curate a feed that is full of your friends' flowers and babies and animal pictures. The next piece of advice is where ideas diverge, and so I'll share a couple of different ideas. The first And my favorite is Wendell-Berry's. I cope with my daily allowance of my bummer phone by balancing that with time outside. I spend a lot of time each week noticing beauty. It is best when I'm out walking in it, but honestly, noticing the sunset from the car or the neighbor's flowers from across the street will do. Just spend some time breathing in that which is beautiful and be grateful for it. David Otten's take on presence is another version of this. Figure out where presence pools for you. Is it someplace beautiful outside? Your garden? Is it having tea with your spouse or your best friend? Is it helping somebody else by bringing them dinner? What can you do to cultivate stillness and ease in your life? What can you do to offer that quiet, supportive presence to another person? Last week, I went with my parents to Diamond Lake, a place down near Crater Lake where my dad likes to fish. He's had a few fishing partners down there over the years, often his brother or cousin, now his friend John. It used to be that my mom was happy staying home on those trips, but now Mom can't be alone anymore because she can't see and she needs a lot of physical help with mobility issues. She's also suffering from some age-related cognitive decline. And so Dad brings her, but she can't be alone for long enough for Dad to go out fishing. Last year, John's wife, Kathy, spent a lot of time with her when they went on their annual trip. And that was great. But this year, Dad said to me, I know what I want for my birthday. And I don't know about you, but when an 80-year-old man actually tells you what he wants, you do your best, because they don't say that very often. And Dad said, I'd like to go on at least one more fishing trip with John, and I can't do it alone. Will you come with us in the RV and help Mom? And it was a really challenging trip in several ways, which I won't go into because of my mom's privacy. But it was also a deeply intimate time with my parents. And it is challenging right now because I would really like them to come to Portland and go into assisted living. And this isn't a choice that I can make for them, and it's not a choice that they feel ready to make yet. But I am also the one who will have to live with the consequences of that. After a frustrating conversation, I started reading to my mom, some short stories, then a bit from a sermon that I had in my bag, and I sang a chorus of a song. And Mom said, I just love your voice. You just sing so beautifully. And so I sang to her for about 40 minutes. I sang songs that we both remembered from sitting in the car waiting to pick my sister up from preschool when I was about 5. I sang songs that I sang to my kids as lullabies. It was really lovely to just sort of put my fears aside for a little bit and just be together. I also got to go fishing with my dad for the first time in over 15 years. We do well sitting on the water together. It gives both of us an expansiveness to talk or just to be quiet together. We both need that resting in the grace of the world. I think that the peace of Wild Things and Outen's presence are both really important as antidotes to despair, but they aren't enough. Jessica Winter, writing for The New Yorker, notes that Republicans are quick to send thoughts and prayers to shooting victims, but are almost quicker to shoot down any and all gun legislation, somehow believing that arming teachers is the best option to stop school shootings, an option soundly rejected by actual teachers. Here is where I need and wish to add that it is a certain breed of Republican that we are talking about here. There are good, moderate Republicans out there, and some of them are part of our congregation. And this is not meant to be a slam on a particular party, but this is a slam on a way a particular party is working in some ways these days. Jessica Winter writes, Republicans, as we know, get what they want. It is their best feature. They have vacuumed up the state legislatures, gerrymandered much of the country, stacked the Supreme Court and federal judgeships, turned back the clock on LGBTQ rights, paralyzed entire school districts with engineered panics over critical race theory and grooming, ended, so it seems, reproductive rights as a constitutionally guaranteed freedom, and blocked all attempts at gun control legislation. If the leaders of this particular movement, which in Texas managed to ban most abortions and criminalize health care for trans kids in the space of a school year, took real objection to murdered children, they would never simply accept their deaths as the unfortunate cost of honoring the Founding Fathers' rights to take up muskets against hypothetical government tyranny. They would act. And this brings us to the second thing that we must do. It is something that some of us are already doing, and that's running for office and working to get candidates in alignment with our values elected to office. We currently have 2 members serving on school boards and 2 members who unfortunately lost elections for the state house and Senate. Now, our congregation cannot take stances on elections of candidates, though it doesn't stop the religious right. But it's something we need to do as individuals and in concert with organizations like UU The Vote. In the 1980s, the Christian right began to build political power by electing members of school boards and city councils. Their strategy was well thought out, and it worked. They might not have imagined that their ultimate presidential candidate would have been a thrice married misogynist billionaire who never attends church, but they have somehow managed to build enough power in a nation run by the Electoral College in such a way that candidates who lose the popular vote often win the presidential election. And this matters in every way possible. It matters because 7 justices appointed for life decide how white men who only thought white male landowners should be able to vote really meant the Constitution to be interpreted. It matters because climate change won't be stopped by recycling or using the right light bulbs. It will be stopped when governments make corporations stop using single-use plastics and building cars reliant on fossil fuels. Individual actions aren't nothing, but they aren't nearly enough to turn the tide of global warming and climate change. That will take worldwide governmental and corporate action, and right now the corporate billionaires just don't care enough to do it. My dear friend and colleague, the Reverend Jeremy Rutledge, the minister at Circular Church, a UCC congregation in Charleston, South Carolina, wrote about ideas of the philosopher William James. History is a bath of blood, James wrote. It is horrible reading. Yeah, and so is our newspaper, Jeremy thought. I wondered how to read James in this moment. Jeremy writes that the most important thing to him in this moment is James's idea that we probably don't need so much leisure. Rather than be layabouts, we should be hard workers because it's good for us. And to read him now is to hear the Uvalde shooter, to imagine that young man alone in his room, bored and radicalized, nothing significant or meaningful or challenging for him to do. And not just him, but all the shooters, staring at their screens, nursing their grievances. James, I think, would take their guns and give them a shovel. Do something with yourself, he might say. I think he might say the same to us as well, he continues. We're not violent and radicalized like the shooters, but many of us are able to spend time in leisure. We read, we stream, we consume. And we often despair because the world is both literally and figuratively on fire. I know it is, James might say. Get up and throw yourself in. Call your blasted senator. March in the Pride Parade. Bake some bread and take it to the bereaved. Help a kid with his homework. Don't stay still. Make your life significant. Will yourself to belief and action. Bring your moral energy not to war, but to the struggle. Despair for the world grows in us, my friends. There is no one clear answer. Vote. Call your senator. Help your neighbor. Clean the church kitchen with your friends. Bring your moral energy to the struggle and sit by the lake when it all becomes too much. When I was installed here, the invitations used a quote from the Talmud, the commentary on the Torah, the Jewish scriptures. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, nor are you free to abandon it. Do what you can do, my friends. No more and no less. Action, presence, stillness, in community, rinse and repeat, are as close to a remedy for despair as I can come up with. I hope it helps. Blessed be, my friends, and amen.